Hello, Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com. I want to continue the conversation I was having with regard to sweeteners and the mind diet. Now, this conversation was prompted when a visitor to the website asked me a question about what sweeteners were allowed on the mind diet. Then the reader asked specifically about alternative sweeteners like monk fruit and stevia and honey and those kinds of things. In the first video in this series, what I did was to put the question to Rush University. Rush University is the university which originated the mind diet protocols. So I actually asked them, are sweeteners allowed? And the response that I got was the mind diet doesn't really address sweeteners at all. They're just not discussed. But that doesn't mean that there's no recommendation at all, in the sense that sugar is well known to be connected to things like obesity and diabetes that have raised the risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of cognitive impairment. So the basic sense was that while the mind diet protocols per se don't really comment on the use of sweeteners or sugar or anything like that, there's still general health reasons to disfavor at least heavy use of sugar in a person's diet. And that's fine, but it still leaves the question a bit nebulous, because the question still is, what about artificial sweeteners? Can sweeteners that may have non-nutritive content or no caloric effect, ones that aren't processed by the body as sugar, what would we say about those? And so I thought I would move into a discussion of that, but as I was preparing to do that, and I have a list of 20 sweeteners that I'm going to discuss, as I was preparing to discuss those sweeteners, I realized that there was some groundwork that I needed to do just to refresh myself on basic sort of high school chemistry regarding the differences in a monosaccharide, disaccharides. And so what I thought I would do, rather than take up the video time when I actually get to those 20 sweeteners, I thought I would have a preliminary or sort of an intermediate video between the first and the second where I lay a little bit of that groundwork. So if you are already up on this and you don't need a refresher, or if you have some other reason to simply want to get right to the sweetener content, look for that future video. It'll be installment number 3. But for me, I thought I would just go through a little bit of the background information, just kind of, again, as a refresher for those who need it, like I did, or as an introduction for maybe people who have not studied this stuff before in any other context. And why I'm doing this, I think, hopefully will become a little bit more apparent as we move along. So the first point about sugar essentially is that sugar is a carbohydrate. Now, carbohydrates, also called carbs, are one of 3 macronutrients. So there are 3 macronutrients, and what the best way of describing these are maybe is macro just means large. So they're large scale nutrients, or if you want to think of them as types of food that the human body needs in large quantities just in order to be healthy. So besides carbs, the other 2 macronutrients that are usually listed in this regard are fats and proteins. So carbs, fats, proteins. And between these 3, these are going to constitute the fundamental component of a person's diet. And you might hear people who are more health conscious, certain exercise aficionados and bodybuilders and the like of that, will discuss their macros. And in virtue of referencing those macros, what they're basically saying is how much by way of carbohydrates are they eating or ingesting, how much are they eating in terms of fats and protein, and they usually deliver these in terms of percentages. Now that is a separate tangent, and I'm not going to get into that here, but that's what they're referring to when they say macros, the macronutrients of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Now, sugars, as a particular kind of carbohydrate, come in 3 main varieties. It's kind of an overarching theme of 3 here. So the first category are going to be the monosaccharides. Now, mono is a prefix that basically means 1. So the idea here is that the monosaccharide sugars are those sugars that are made up of 1 sugar component. And sometimes in the reading you'll see this referred to as a sugar monomer. Now, the other 2 main types, are called disaccharides, that's type number 2, and di, the prefix di, means 2. These are sugars that are composed of 2 monomers or sugar components. Poly, P-O-L-Y, means many. So polysaccharide basically means a saccharide, a sugar that is composed of many of these different monomer sugar components. Now, predictably, there are 3 main monosaccharides. Now, there are many more than that, actually. There are a number of these things, but the three main ones that you encounter in the reading, at least in very basic level reading like this, is going to be these three. Number one, glucose. Now in some reading I have had the word dextrose presented as a synonym for glucose, and that's the way I'm going to treat it here, but in other contexts I've seen them being distinguished. I'm not a chemist, and I didn't want to take the time to go far enough into that. I'm sure a dissertation could probably be written just on glucose, and I'm sure there have been dissertations written. So you have to kind of cut off your information gathering at a certain spot. So it's not important whether dextrose is different or glucose is the same. It's not important. I think they are the same, but the point is that glucose is one of these simple sugars, one of these monosaccharides. The second main monosaccharide is fructose. Now fructose is essentially a fruit sugar, so it's often found in berries and the like of this. Sometimes fructose apparently might also be called levulose. And the third main type of monosaccharide is galactose. But there are a number of other lesser known monosaccharides, so they're not just three, there's a number of these. Other ones include deoxyribose, etherose, glyceraldehyde, mannose, and ribose. You might notice that the ending aldehyde and then there's an ose ending, and that has to do with the structure. Apparently there's two different kinds of structures that these simple sugars can have, but once again, too far into the weeds, not gonna get into that here, and I'm not competent to do it. But usually monosaccharides are going to taste sweet to us. Now disaccharides, as we said, are composed of two sugar components, and so the combination of sugars, the combination of monomers is going to make the difference in terms of the different disaccharides. So for example, the disaccharide lactose, which is often found in milk, and it's sometimes a troublesome constituent for some people who might have a lactose intolerance, but lactose is composed of two sugar monomers, and in this case it's galactose and glucose. Or again, a second disaccharide, maltose. Maltose is a byproduct of starch digestion, and maltose, being a disaccharide, is composed of two sugar monomers, and in fact it's actually two glucose monomers, so it's composed of two glucose pieces put together, and now you have maltose. The final disaccharide that I'll get into, and in some ways this is going to be one of the most important for the ongoing conversation, is going to be sucrose. So sucrose, S-U-C-R-O-S-E, is basically the chemical name for what we more commonly refer to as table sugar. And being a disaccharide, sucrose is a composite of two monomers, so it's composite of fructose and glucose. Now similarly to the monosaccharides, disaccharides usually have a sweet taste to human beings. We recognize them as sweet and we gravitate to those things for various reasons. Now the final category is the polysaccharides, and as again we said, poly means many, so these are saccharides that are composed of many different monomers, and I'm sure that there's any number of these. But some of the ones that you'll find, I'll just list them since I listed some of the others, are going to be cellulose, glycogen, and starch would be the third main one. But in addition to that, you'll find also references to something called maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is sometimes put into energy drinks and sports drinks because of the way in which it works with respect to what's called the glycemic index. Now the glycemic index is essentially a scale, and it goes from 0 to 100, and the glycemic index basically rates a food or a sugar on the basis of the effect that it has on blood sugar levels. So glycemic index is going to be very important for keeping track for purpose of diabetics to try and control their diet. But for anybody, often bodybuilders will make reference to glycemic index as well because they're also conscious of blood sugar levels. And I think just part of general health, it's probably best if people become more aware of these kinds of things. So the various sugars are going to have various different rankings on the GI or glycemic index, and it's beyond the scope of this video to get into what those actually are, but you should be aware that different sugars have different effects on the blood, and as we move forward into a discussion of some of these various artificial or alternative sweeteners, depending on what we're looking at, and I have a list that includes both types, part of the conversation that's relevant is going to be where they fall on the glycemic index. Now, further preliminary conversation should be regarding the word natural sugar, and then it's often contrasted with added sugar. So natural sugar, just like what it sounds like, is going to be sugar that's found in plants, usually fruits, vegetables, just naturally. It's just part of the constitution of that plant on a cellular level. Added sugars, on the other hand, are those sugars that are mixed in generally to processed foods, and usually they're added to enhance taste. Now some people with maybe a more conspiratorial turn of mind might suggest that they might also be added in order to generate cravings for whatever that food item is, but for the most part, just on the surface level, sugar is added because sugar tastes good. Now sometimes you'll also find the word refined sugar And according to Healthline, and I'll put it up on the screen here, I thought this was kind of a helpful way of thinking about what's the difference now in terms of refined sugar. And Healthline states basically this: refined sugar is made by extracting and processing the sugar naturally found in foods like corn, sugar beets, and sugar cane. And then they go on to say, this refined sugar is then added to foods for various purposes, including to boost flavor. And so essentially, refined sugar is a description of the process by which a processing plant takes the natural sugar in a plant out so that it can be added. So when we talk about added sugar, it had previously been processed or refined, and now it's going to be added into some kind of bakery item or processed food or whatever. Now, there are a number of sugars that are listed on certain lists in terms of ones that you'll commonly run into when a reference to added sugar is made. These are going to include things like agave, brown sugar, confectioner's sugar, corn syrup, dextrose, high fructose corn syrup, honey, maple syrup, molasses, and then sometimes you'll see raw sugar. So these are a few preliminary concepts, and the reason I wanted to put this into a video was because as I go into my list of 20 different sugar alternatives, sweetener alternatives, or whatever you want to call them, I'm going to refer back to some of these words, and I don't want to have to spend time in that other video to define them, particularly because 20 different sweeteners is going to take me some time to kind of move through, and so I wanted to have just a separate video that I could refer people back to. And if you found this helpful, I do ask you to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it comes available. Bear in mind that this is a bridge video between part number 1, where I kind of went into some of the problems with sugar and what the Mind Diet says or doesn't say explicitly about sweeteners, and part number 3, where I will try to work through some of these lists, and I have a list of 20 different artificial and alternative sweeteners, and it's going to be a composite, and essentially I'm going to try and take a look at those with an eye towards, of course, cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's, and the like of that. So as a final word here, remember that high sugar in the diet can have a negative effect on cognition directly, but mostly the warning has to do with the indirect effect in terms of causing things or being linked to things like obesity and diabetes that raise your risk for Alzheimer's or dementia. So I thank you so much for being with me today. I look forward to seeing you again in part 3. Thank you so much.